Good evening, and please take your seats. I want to welcome all of you to the 12th Annual Kristensen Lecture. My name is Nora Diemleitner, and I'm the president of St. John's College. The Kristensen Memorial Lecture Series is jointly sponsored by the college and the United States Naval Academy. It honors Lieutenant Commander Erik S. Kristensen, an alumnus of both of our great institutions, as he completed his graduate degree at St. John's upon returning from his first tour of duty. Erik Kristensen, a Navy SEAL, was killed in the line of duty in 2005 while leading a search and rescue mission in Afghanistan. There's so much more to say about Erik, about his intellect and his bravery, but let me summarize it in this way. I've heard Erik described as a naval officer in mind and body, but a Johnny at heart. He truly embodied the best of both of our institutions, and this lecture in his name allows us to honor his legacy. It is my honor to welcome Erik's parents who join us tonight, Rear Admiral Edward Kristensen and Suzanne Sam Kristensen. I know that it cannot always be easy for you to be here, but we're truly appreciated. I also want to thank all of those who have supported this special lecture series in a myriad of ways for more than a decade. The United States Naval Academy and its current Superintendent and Vice Admiral Yvette Davids, Lieutenant Commander Mike Sempella, to whose vision and persistence we owe this lecture, to the Navy SEAL Foundation for their financial support, and to the St. John's College leadership led by Dean Susie Paulman and the head of our Graduate Institute, Brendan Boyle. I am also delighted to welcome tonight many of you who knew Erik personally, including the U.S. Naval Academy Superintendent Vice Admiral Yvette Davids, Jeff Webb, the President and CEO of the Academy's Alumni Association and Foundation, and Jim Bates, the United States Naval Academy Deputy Superintendent and Chief of Staff. And I know there are many more of you in this audience. The Kristensen Lecture brings together Johnnies and midshipmen to consider and discuss truly important questions we hold in common. This, along with other opportunities such as Socratic seminars, career development partnerships, leadership conferences, the fellowship class, our master's program, and yes, of course, croquet, are all ways in which we collaborate with each other. It's a long list by now, and we're truly proud of this. I should also say that this year, St. John's truly did its part in the collaboration by losing the hard-fought croquet match, and we of course warmly congratulate the Academy team on their win. I am particularly pleased with the format for tonight's event. General Allen not only graciously agreed, but I'd say even wholeheartedly supported the idea of joining a student from each of our great institutions in conversation. And as all of you who know a Johnny realize, we enjoy conversations and discussions generally a lot more than lectures. So we're really delighted to find General Allen in conversation with two of our students, one from the U.S. Naval Academy and one from St. John's College here tonight. I now welcome the Graduate Institute's Associate Dean, Brendan Boyle, to introduce tonight's program and participants.
Thank you, President Diemleitner. Let me begin by echoing President Diemleitner's warm welcome of Admiral and Mrs. Kristensen, in whose honor we gather here this evening, in whose son's honor we gather here this evening, and whose memory we celebrate. Unlike so many in this room, I am sorry not to have known your son personally, though no doubt his courage and intellect still suffuse the halls of the Bar Buchanan Center, the home of the Graduate Institute, which I am privileged at the moment to lead. thank you, Admiral and Mrs. Kristensen, for joining us this evening, and trust that you will find the evening a fitting tribute to the memory of your son. It is rather easy to make a broad distinction between the two singular institutions of higher education that sit side by side in Annapolis, St. John's College and the United States Naval Academy. The one, a bookish retreat, lost in thought and untroubled by the tumult of the world's events. The other, the training ground for the nation's leaders, where humanistic learning is sometimes overshadowed by the imperatives of technical expertise. But of course, this is deeply misleading. The one in whose honor we gather tonight, Erik Kristensen, showed the complementarity of the two institutions, showed how easy and indeed how necessary it is to move between the active and the contemplative, how the deliberative excellence required to lead soldiers grows out of the quiet, contemplative activity of reading closely in community with others. General John Allen comes to us tonight bedecked with many of the highest honors our nation awards. Defense Distinguished Service Medal 3 times, Defense Superior Service Medal, and many others. He has commanded U.S. and international forces in Afghanistan. He has led the Brookings Institute. But in preparation for this evening, I had the privilege of speaking twice over Zoom with the general, and I was surprised to hear him return on several occasions to his time as commandant of the Naval Academy, and more specifically, to his creation of a course at the Academy during his time as commandant, as if that act, the creation of this course, was a singular achievement in his career, an achievement of which he will always be proud. I think that this fact, the fact that General Allen returned as frequently as he did to the creation of this course, already speaks volumes about him. That in a life full of distinction, he thinks of the creation of a course as of particular note. I find that a sign of his selflessness and his commitment to the moral enterprise that is the education of young men and women. But it is the title of the course that I want now to draw attention to. That course was called Human Factors in Combat. And there we can see in the very title of the course the togetherness, the complementarity that I mentioned above. That combat is inseparable from a form of humanistic and scientific inquiry. That excellence in the latter, excellence in humanistic and scientific inquiry, is a precondition for excellence in the former. The midshipmen in that class, which continues to this day, read any number of books that would find a happy place in our own program of study at St. John's College. And they no doubt encounter in that course men who, like General Allen, have put together the twin excellences of rigorous humanistic study and military valor in the service of our nation. But we too at St. John's are no strangers to books in which the human factors of combat are front and center. Early on in their time here, Johnnies read about the Athenian general Nicias, who knew well the human factors, the history, character, practices of the enemy, the very factors that his compatriots had, in their haste, completely ignored. Or, on the other side of that same battle, the Spartan general Brasidas, who, unusual for a Spartan, knew the one preeminent human factor, persuasive speech, and put that factor in the service of excellence in combat. But I wonder if our students, the Johnnies here, find their most meaningful encounter with a general who, like General Allen preeminently, knew the human factors in combat when in their senior year they read War and Peace. There they encounter General Kutuzov, a man whose understanding of war is inseparable from his attention to just those human factors. All of this is simply to say that these two singular institutions are not so very far apart. And indeed, it is to say that I hope the general finds himself very much at home on our grounds. We have Erik Kristensen to look to as a model of a man at home in both worlds, in both institutions, humane in combat, courageous in intellect. And we are honored to be able to say the same of General John Allen, to whom, in a brief moment, we will have the privilege of learning from. He will be joined in conversation by two students, Miss Millie Ransahoff of St. John's College and Midshipman Mr. Josh Herbert. The conversation will go on for about 35 or 40 minutes, after which we have a brief pause and we'll take some questions from the floor. But without any further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to General John Allen.
Thank you, General Allen, for joining us tonight, and I'd like to again return to the namesake of this lecture, Lieutenant Commander Erik Kristensen, who was, of course, an alumnus of the St. John's Graduate Institute as well as the United States Naval Academy. He led and ultimately died in combat. What is the value of an education grounded in the classics in our era of rapid technological advancement and uncertainty?
Well, first, President Dean Leitner, thank you very much for the invitation to be here this evening. And it is wonderful to see this great audience. Rear Admiral and Mrs. Kristensen, it's my honor to meet you. I had not before tonight. I've served with SEALs my entire career. I did not have the honor to serve with your son, but I knew many of the SEALs that did, and they are a spectacular organization. In fact, there are a lot of SEALs in here tonight, and I'm worried about who's keeping the world safe while we're having this conversation. We don't want to have too many SEALs in here because there's a lot of people out there that need to get dealt with. I also am very happy to see a number of very old friends who are here. I think a couple of classmates and some folks I served with when I was commandant here 20 years ago. And, years ago I used to say, I haven't seen you in 6 years, or I haven't seen you in 10 years. Now I just tell people I haven't seen you in 30 pounds. And that just gets the floor leveled very quickly. My own view is that the greatest commanders also have the greatest steeping in the humanitarian environment, in the humanities. And I got that originally from my father. My father was a Navy Mustang, up through the ranks. Aboard the USS Kearney, was torpedoed by a German U-boat before the war started. long service in the naval service, but never went to college. And on his own, he purchased a set of the great books and read to me from those books as a small child, and imbued in me the sense that a serving officer must, as John Paul Jones would say, it's not enough just to be a capable mariner. You must be that, of course, but much more. And in the world that we live in today, increasingly dominated by technology and changes in technology, we need to ground our leadership, the individuals who will lead our forces forward in combat. We need to ground them in a very serious understanding of the humanity that we bring to the battlefield as a military that emerges from the great democracy on this planet. It's what differentiates us in so many ways from many other countries whose militaries are not steeped in a commitment to the Constitution, who aren't steeped in a commitment to the rule of law. And one of the reasons for that is because we as a nation place humanity at such a high level in terms of a commitment to human rights, the rule of law, a free and independent media. These are all things that come to us as a result of a nation that is steeped in the humanities. And so while I was a midshipman at the Naval Academy in operations analysis and sort of applied math, we were transitioning at the time, I always envied the curriculum here across the street because my father had been such a proponent of reading the great books, and because he was such a proponent of the whole rounding of officers, not just in the technical dimension of warfighting, but in the human dimension of the commitment of officers to the full capabilities of our services. And it isn't just about warfighting. You know, some of the most important dimensions of what we do when we go to war isn't the taking of human life, isn't the destruction of infrastructure, although that is inherent when the United States unleashes its military. Let me just make a point here, and I'm not sure most people have ever heard it put this way. In the process of taking human life, warfare is about homicide. But as America goes to war, while that may end up being a necessity of the means by which we deal with our opponents, we are not in the business of murder. It's an important distinction. And I think one of the great dimensions of our education here and our commitment to the humanities and our commitment to human rights is that while we may have to go to war to defend our interests and those of our precious allies around the world, while we may have to fight and we may have to take human life, we do so in a manner that is guided by our humility, by our commitment to human rights, and ultimately to our commitment that what we do serves our mission, but is not a matter of murder. This is a really important point, and it's not often spoken about. This is why that's so important in our curricula. You know, we're very good at warfighting, but the very best commanders I've ever known were those commanders who were tempered in their thinking by a careful, close reading of the humanities. That's what this curriculum is here. That's what the Academy stands for in many respects as well. And I think that that's why when I was the commander in Afghanistan, when I led troops in Iraq, when I served in Bosnia, the closest allies that I had in those fights were often representatives of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Why? Because when we were fighting, we would ultimately liberate populations from the oppression of Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or ISIS. And they needed to have the support of a human organization that could help them. And so I can't emphasize enough that to round out an officer's education in a technical environment, a close reading of the humanities is a very important dimension of that education.
Thank you, sir.
So it seems to me that you're suggesting that reading humanities enables one to develop leadership ability and helps one to make good decisions in leadership. Could you maybe say more about that?
Well, you know, some of you were in the audience a couple of years ago when I received the Distinguished Graduate Award. And in the course of that speech that we were able to give, about 8 minutes, I talked about that we are all ultimately going to be confronted with something called a moment of truth. And what I said is you got to get ready for it. Because when it comes, it's going to come very quickly, and you have to have thought through how you'll react in that moment of truth. And one of the things I said was you have to live your courage and display your courage for all of those around you to be inspired. The term inspired is a very important term. It comes from a religious basis on to fill with the Spirit. I'm not going to get religious on you here, but inspirational leaders are those who inspire the greatness within those they lead. And so, live your courage, display your courage, be an inspirational leader. But then one of the things that I said was, the great leaders are also compassionate. And in America, the great leaders have a bias for preserving life, not taking life. It doesn't mean it isn't going to happen. And by God, we're really good at it when the time comes. We are really good at it. But what we're also really good at is knowing the limits of the rule of law as it relates to military operations and how we should conduct them. And I can't emphasize that enough as we go forward. Understanding that in leadership, having to be an important part of your leadership is critical. Now let me just, a quick sea story here. We all know about sea stories. I was a second-class midshipman at the Naval Academy. I think we have some classmates here. Any 76ers in here?
There's one.
Okay. Great. Well, I probably owe them money. They're going to hit me up afterwards. We were in our second-class leadership course when the U.S. POWs were released from Vietnam. And a number of them were sent to the Naval Academy to teach, to recover from the experience of having been a POW, in some cases, years and years. And one of the greatest experiences I had at the Naval Academy, and maybe in my life, because it really shaped my leadership style and leadership abilities, was to be mentored personally by a recently released POW by the name of Jack Fellows. Now, somebody in this audience may have known Jack Fellows, and when I was commandant here, I invited him to everything that we did in the commandant's quarters. Jack Fellows talked to us about the humanity between the POWs for years, and how they supported each other, and how they took care of each other, and how the bravery and the courage of the POWs every single day inspired each other to endure unbelievable adversity. And he really taught me a lot about selflessness, about inspirational leadership, about the willingness to sacrifice everything on behalf of those you lead when the time comes. And that was an experience that I had at the Naval Academy I might not have otherwise had in my entire life, had it not been for Jack Fellows being returned from the Hanoi Hilton to be one of my instructors at the Naval Academy. So from a very early moment, the role of humanity in a warfighter's professional ethos has been very important to me. Because I said, the United States is actually very, very good at taking human life in warfighting and the destruction of enemy infrastructure in warfighting. What separates us so often from those that we fight and those that we may have to fight is that central to all of that is that our officers and our warfighting capabilities are guided by the rule of law, the law of armed conflict, the Geneva Convention, international humanitarian law. And I'm not saying go light on the enemy, I'm telling you. I commanded forces that we were not light on the enemy. But when we went to war, we did it the way America should go to war. And that is informed by the classics and a commitment to humanity.
So, sir, as was mentioned in the introduction, there is still a class at USNA called Human Factors in Combat,
Yeah.
which you were large part in pioneering, and from our conversation before, Mr. Fellows was also an important part in your development of that class.
Yep.
So my question is, can you explain what your thinking was in developing that class?
Sure.
And then what, as a follow-up, what are the human dimensions in combat?
Well, I had been the director of the infantry officer course at the basic school. And what became very clear to me, and that's a course where all infantry second lieutenants and ground intelligence officers go through an extremely intensive program. It's probably 10 or 12 weeks long now, but it's an extremely intensive night-oriented live fire program. And it became very clear to me at that time when I owned that course, we were in Desert Shield, getting ready potentially to go across the barrier into Desert Storm. And it became very clear to me that the ground-gaining organization of the United States Marine Corps was going to be the infantry. And an officer showed up in my office one day at Quantico from the Manpower branch, and he said, "How quickly can you go to the mobilization output for second lieutenants in the infantry community?" I said, I can't tell you right now, but I can do it pretty quickly. Why do you ask? He said, because we think that the defenses that we're going to have to go through to fight Saddam Hussein will probably force us to expend as much as 3 years of the production of second lieutenants in the infantry and the Marine Corps. In other words, we anticipated really horrendous casualties. And because the warfighting dimension, the close combat dimension in those days, with that potential war, was so vivid to me, I created a course called Human Factors in Combat for the Marine second lieutenants. And we talked in great detail about what it's like to lead people in close combat. It's a very different environment than a lot of other folks. There's some SEALs in here who could tell you about it personally. It's a very different environment than many of the other warfighting specialties. But the ground-gaining organization of the United States Marine Corps in those days was going to be the infantry, and I needed to prepare those lieutenants for the realities of leading troops in close combat against the enemy. Clearing trenches, clearing fortified positions, etc. That gave me the idea about creating that course, the Human Factors in Combat, where we actually studied history of leaders in close combat, leading troops at the point of the bayonet. So fast forward years later, I'm the Commandant of Midshipmen here at the Naval Academy. I was deputy at the time. A month later, I become Commandant on 9/11. And then I was the Commandant during the invasion of Iraq. And the entire environment here, as far as I was concerned, needed to change immediately. We were in 2 big wars as a country, and we still had to keep the Chinese at arm's length in the Western Pacific. And I knew that the midshipmen that I was leading within the Brigade of Midshipmen were headed to war. There was no question after 9/11 and after the invasion of Iraq. There was no question that the brigade was headed to war. And there was no course in the entire curriculum that addressed the realities of warfighting in close quarters or what your troops go through when they go through the stomach or gut-wrenching, stomach-churning environment as you're launching across the line of departure into what will certainly be potentially a life-taking firefight. There was no one in the academy at that time who'd been in combat. No one on the staff, etc. So we created this course, Human Factors in Combat, where I brought folks in who had been in combat to talk to the midshipmen constantly about the realities, to include how do you write a letter home? How do you deal with troops that simply have nothing else to give? And they're sometimes called combat stress disorder. How do you do all those things when you're facing the reality that you're going to graduate, you're going to go to school, and you're headed into the desert? Or you're headed for the high ground in Afghanistan. And we created that course, and on weekends I sent groups of midshipmen 4 at a time into the emergency rooms of hospitals in the area so that they could be acquainted with the reality of the carnage of an emergency room, because I didn't want them to face it for the first time in reality in combat. So that's why I created the course. I rotated out in September of 2003, and I think the course died shortly thereafter. And last year, one of our officers who runs Leadership, Ethics, and Law, Andrew, help me. Thank you, I knew you'd know it. He found the syllabus in a file cabinet, and he's recreated it. And I think that may be one of the great contributions to this already extraordinary curriculum, which is to give the midshipmen, the men and women who are going to lead our troops in close combat, an exposure to some of the realities associated with the nature of this business that we're in. And I think it's really important to have that exposure. So what are the human factors in combat? Well, fear. How do you deal with fear? How do you deal with sleep deprivation? How do you deal with wounding? How do you deal with death in your ranks? Death that has taken someone from your ranks, or how do you deal with the death of individuals that you've inflicted death on an operation? All of those things need to be dealt with. And leaders need to understand, need to have studied, need to have spoken about these things long before the first exposure to it in combat. And that's why I created the course in 2003, beginning of 2003, and that's why Captain Ledford recreated it now, because I think it's absolutely essential to the curriculum here to prepare our young sailors, Marines, ultimately some portion of which will be SEALs, to prepare them for the realities of warfare in close combat, because no one is closer to it than the second lieutenant and the ensign. And it's an obligation that I had then. I think it's an obligation that the institution has now, and that's the reason I created the course.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. You've also written a book, or co-written a book called Turning Point, about the development of AI technology, and another one called Future War, mostly referring to the defense of Europe, but also about what is going to happen with the introduction of new technologies into war. And in those books you discuss how the character of war has always changed, but that the nature of war has remained the same, but that now with the introduction of AI technology, the nature of war is changing. So I'm curious about how you think leadership in war will change with the introduction of new technologies.
That's a really important question. If you've been following what's going on the battlefield in Ukraine, the nature or the character of war, the changes in technology have been really dramatic. And it's going back to the Clausewitzian principle, that there is a character of war, which is the technical dimension of war, and there's the nature of war, which is the human dimension of war. Clausewitz would say that the two need to be in an equilibrium so that the humans who wield the technology can wield it to the maximum extent capable, but also wield it in the human, with the context of the human nature of warfare itself. And when they get out of whack, when technology outstrips the capacity for the human dimension to understand the full capabilities of these technologies, then strategic surprise can actually be the outcome. And we should be very concerned that we're educating our officers to understand the emerging technologies as we see them coming forth, and ultimately how those technologies will be managed on the battlefield, applied against our enemies, and ultimately constrained in ways that keep us within the rule of law. The challenge that we have, I think, and this is getting a bit esoteric, but as we see large language models and other artificially intelligent algorithms emerging more frequently in our warfighting capabilities, whether they're in the sustainment or the maintenance aspects of it, or it's in intelligence collection, intelligence processing and dissemination, which can be far more rapidly accomplished with artificial intelligence, whether it's in decision support or decision assistance in command and control, or whether it ultimately is in target acquisition, target identification, and potentially target engagement, all supported by artificial intelligence. What's happening is that warfare is accelerating. And as warfare accelerates, as artificial intelligence plays a larger role in the various components of this machine, which ultimately is our warfighting machine, we're going to have to come to grips, because our enemies are unleashing full autonomy in their capabilities against us, meaning they potentially can move faster than we can in conflict and in battle. We have to come to grips with the fact that there will be some functions that have been traditionally human functions in military operations that may be, and actually are being now, relegated to algorithms, artificially intelligent algorithms, increasingly. We had a conversation over dinner about where does this end? Does the United States ultimately find itself in a position where it will, as the Chinese intend, as the Russians are on the battlefield in Ukraine, going to unleash fully autonomous lethal systems into the battle space? Whether they're aviation systems, whether they're ground mobile systems, or whether they're maritime systems. Fully autonomous, so that the system does the target acquisition, target identification within its capabilities, and then target engagement, potentially taking human life, conceivably, without a human being in the decision-making process to prevent that from making a mistake. Now, all commanders in combat, and what it was the case for me throughout my career, at all 4 stars I was in combat, but all commanders in combat have an inherent responsibility to do 3 things if you're going to fight. The first is you have to decide about the necessity for the use of lethal force, number 1. Number 2, you have to be able to discriminate between non-combatants and combatants when you apply lethal force. That's the rule of law as we understand it and as we are committed to it. And number 3, you use just enough force to accomplish the mission for which you have made the decision to apply lethal force. Now, for us, I don't think we believe that artificial intelligence is yet sufficiently sophisticated, these algorithms, first of all, to make that decision about the employment of lethal force. We don't want an algorithm to make that decision. And then it's very difficult for algorithms when everyone's wearing the same uniform or the same clothing in a battle space to make the distinction between a combatant and a non-combatant. And then it's going to be very difficult for an algorithm to decide what the proportionality will be of the lethal force that is applied. Those are our concerns. And those are the concerns of a military in a democracy that is guided by the rule of law and committed to support of the Constitution. But our enemies don't have those concerns. And right now on the battlefield in Ukraine, fully autonomous systems on both sides are taking human life, and we're watching this very closely. Roughly 70% of the casualties on the battlefield in Ukraine today are inflicted by drones, drones being the euphemistic term for all 3 dimensions, air, land, and sea. So as we see technology changing, we're going to have to make some pretty hard decisions about where technology will take its place in our war-fighting capabilities. Because as warfare accelerates, an acceleration from artificial intelligence is touching almost every dimension of our society. Acceleration. Everything is moving faster. As warfare accelerates, how do we remain true to our principles as a military of a democracy and not turn over the business of taking human life to an algorithm? And that's the wicked problem that we are facing today going forward. I don't know where this is going to end. I could postulate on that, but that's the challenge that we face today. Our systems are very sophisticated. We have humans in the loop, theoretically, on taking human life, which can intervene to prevent the drone from taking that shot. Or we'll have a human on the loop who's observing the process and just lets it go without intervening. But we have chosen to put a human in the loop. And inherently, in this accelerating environment of warfare, when a human is in the loop and our enemies don't have humans in the loop, guess who's moving faster on the battlefield? Our opponents. The question will be that we'll have to face is, are we ever going to unleash a fully autonomous system in the battle space? I don't know what the answer to that is right now. The question may be that we are sufficiently confident in the development of our algorithms over time that we will delegate those kinds of decisions to a super intelligent algorithm, but we're not there now.
Can I ask, just tying it back to your class on the human elements of war, Is there anything about the introduction of AI into warfighting that will change the things addressed in that class, or are those unchanging elements of war?
At the infantry level, it's not going to be dramatic change. What we'll see is that the battlefield systems will change in the context of there'll be, I've just used the term accelerated, many of the battlefield systems, the collection of intelligence, the analysis of intelligence, the dissemination of intelligence, that can be speeded up enormously. With regard to command and control, commanders can be presented through large language models with operational options far more quickly than they might have otherwise through the normal staff process. Those kinds of things I think we will see accelerate, and we may find artificial intelligence playing a larger role in that area. In the infantry, we will see probably smaller units. We will see units that carry drones as part of their warfighting capabilities, just as we had infantry Marines carry mortars or machine guns. We'll see some element within infantry small units that have the capacity to use drones for remote sensing. And remote sensing will give us better situational awareness about the enemy situation in the battlefield. The question will be ultimately, will we give the small units the capacity to arm those drones so that ultimately if we find a target on the next ridge line or one hill over, can those young infantry troops use those drones ultimately to apply lethal force? I think we're going to see greater computing at the edge, where intelligence information that might have only gone to a battalion commander in the past, the intelligence that I would have received either as a battalion commander forward deployed or as a raid force commander years later, will be far more democratized. We'll see that kind of intelligence far more available to smaller units distributed in the battle space, where they'll be talking in a digital environment and receiving information from the cloud at the tactical edge. I think that will be, those are innovations that we will see in the infantry. But in the end, the infantry is about closing with the enemy and ultimately deciding it with close combat and fire. And we're always going to need to have infantry that can do that. Whereas many of the other dimensions of warfighting on the battlefield may have technologies that are engaged that exist above the infantry warfighting environment. I think we'll see that much of the infantry warfighting environment will be aided by technology, but will not be dramatically changed.
Thank you, sir. You speak of the danger of accelerating AI development into what you call hyper war. But I'm also curious because there is a lot of talk about the regulation of AI, and I'm curious where you think it's needed and also what the dangers are of over-regulating AI.
I direct a geotech center for a European think tank, pro bono, where we're watching very closely the international process of the development of AI. And in Europe, there is, I won't say an overemphasis, but there is a very significant emphasis on the regulation of artificial intelligence to preserve the privacy of the European citizen, to prevent the illicit surveillance of the population. And I think that's healthy, but the European AI entities, the startups, the tech companies, would tell you they are over-regulated and it has stunted their capacity for innovation. So the Europeans will say, we regulate, this is a gross generalization, and I don't mean it, it's not negative, it's just their generalization. We regulate, you Americans innovate. I think one of the things that we talked about in that book in 2017, which is Ancient History, is that the policy environment within which this innovation should occur, in the past, technology policy was usually followed the technology itself by as much as 7 years. That's way too long. We can't afford that any longer. Not only is technology changing, but the rate of change of technology is just breathtaking. And so we need to have a policy environment which emphasizes our capacity to innovate, but provides the environment within our society an assurance of both security and safety. And we've seen that, I think, very substantial movement within the U.S. government and within the U.S. tech industry in the last several years, to I think, our credit. But we're always going to find this tension between a regulatory constraint on the role of artificial intelligence in our societies and the natural private sector intentions to do as much innovation as they possibly can to monetize the science and the technology, ultimately for the bottom line. That tension is always going to exist. How we manage that in the future, I think, is going to have a very important effect on our society, as it will in Europe as well. We don't see that tension in China, for example. China is the largest surveillance state on the planet. Their capacity for artificially intelligent or artificially powered surveillance of virtually the entire population in China is dramatically sophisticated, far ahead of us. We don't even want to compete with them in that regard. But that has given them data and the capacity for compute that gives them near perfect visibility into their population, and we don't ever want to go anywhere near that. The challenge, in my mind, that we face going forward is the challenge that we face with social media and the capacity of social media to penetrate into our society in ways that are difficult for us to control. And we've been loath to try to regulate that because of the challenges associated with the right of free speech, et cetera. I think we're going to see that begin to change. And we just saw some, I think, very promising legislation on holding companies accountable for deep fake pornography. And that is, I think, an important first step that can give us opportunity in other areas as well. We have to innovate. We have to be able to compete with the Chinese, but we have to regulate for the safety of our population and our citizens. Finding the balance between the two of those will be one of the great challenges that we'll face in the years to come.
In Future War, you mentioned that democracies and free nations generally have more difficulty balancing things like what you call human security, like healthcare systems, things like that, with defense. That's a problem that free nations and democracies tend to have more so than autocracies. And that one example that you give of this is that defense does not garner votes in Europe. You quote a British politician, I believe, saying that defense doesn't garner votes. So I'm curious about the degree to which that is something that can be overcome in a free society, or how that needs to be addressed, and maybe you could say a little bit about what the circumstances are in the U.S. with regard to that.
Well, let's start with Europe. I think we have. We can check the numbers if you want to. I think we have somewhere around 60 tech companies in the United States that are valued at $100 billion or more, and we have tech companies that are valued in the trillions. Europe doesn't have any trillion-dollar tech companies, and only 3 or 4 that are valuated at $100 billion or more. So they're well behind the United States, both in terms of the tech enterprise. They're well behind. They're actually quite innovative with a lot of talent, but the economic system does not foster the celebration and the capacity for startups to have the chance that they do in the United States. So until just recently, Europe was not putting the kind of money it needed to into tech development for defense the way we have. Just recently, Ursula von der Leyen who is the president of the European Commission, announced that there would be a European investment of 800 billion euros in military modernization. And the Chancellor of Germany just announced 500 billion euros for German rearmament. And much of that is going to be high tech. And much of that will rely on the capacity of artificial intelligence to play an important role in that. So this idea that Europe was not going to invest in its European modernization has now, in fact, as a result of sort of the political environment we find ourselves in today, and Europe deciding that it really needs to start to take care of itself in a world where the United States may not be coming to support the Europeans in an emergency. They started to invest. And they're very clearly intending to invest in the tech dimension of European industry. And I think that's very positive, actually. In the US, it's hard to say. I mean, I work with a number of tech companies that have had deep relations with defense for a long period of time. And I think we're generally pretty healthy in that regard. We will probably do better. We're hearing that we'll see a $1 trillion, way too much, but $1 trillion defense budget potentially in this administration. And much of that is going to be oriented on modernization, and much of that modernization is going to be based around emerging technologies, one of which is artificial intelligence. So I think we're seeing now that the military in the United States, certainly, and the militaries in Europe, by virtue of the European Commission and the EU more broadly, have made the conscious societal decision they're going to invest in technology, and that technology will be the engine for increased military capability.
Thank you, sir. We spoke over dinner about personalization being made possible through AI, particularly with things like education and healthcare. So I'm curious in what ways you think AI is already making our lives better in that sense and will continue to as well, sir.
I think AI has been, one of the great shaping influences of the 21st century. It's going to shape geopolitical relationships. It's going to shape geostrategic relationships. But at a domestic level, artificial intelligence already plays a role in every one of our lives every single day. If you drove here tonight, you got here potentially because artificial intelligence processed the data coming off a satellite system to get you here when otherwise if you were map bound the way I was, you would probably have been lost. Artificial intelligence is touching education. It's touching the financial industry. Very importantly, I think crucially importantly, it's touching the healthcare system. It's touching medical research. It's touching education. It's given us the capacity, just in education alone, to individualize educational systems to reduce the potential vulnerabilities of a young student to shortcomings in their learning process, and to emphasize the capacity to take advantage of talent, take advantage of strengths of our young students. I think artificial intelligence is going to be a dramatic change to our society across the board, and it already is changing our society across the board. And as I mentioned, in the world I live in one of the tech companies, we consciously think about the effect of artificial intelligence in the acceleration of many of the aspects of society which before artificial intelligence were analog processes, now are digitized, now benefit from artificial intelligence, and things are just moving faster. The ethicists associated with this, and ethicists have to be part of the conversation about how artificial intelligence is applied and ultimately the benefits we should reap, typically talk about the ethical role of artificial intelligence, the legal role of artificial intelligence in the context of the rule of law, and then ultimately the societal impact. The acronym is ELSI. And if we are, as we innovate, thinking about the ethical, legal, and societal impact of artificial intelligence as we seek to apply it to everyday life in America, then I think we'll be okay. That's not really, to me, the problem. I think the big tech companies, the one I work with very closely, is committed to that responsible artificial intelligence, explainable artificial intelligence, accountable artificial intelligence. That's not my concern. My concern are the smaller companies that are in it for the innovation and the monetization of that technology, which may not be properly constrained to protect us. Mustafa Suleyman, if you've not read the book, The Coming Wave, you should read it. It's a fantastic book. And he's worried very much about the containment and the control of these technologies going forward. The technology is going to go forward. It's going to move forward. The question becomes, are we as a society capable of ultimately either containing the negative dimensions of it and then controlling the positive dimensions of it? And I think the jury is still out on that.
If I may, this might be a nice moment to, Mila, do you want to ask one more question? Then we'll turn over to the floor. Why don't you?
Okay.
You seemed right on the cusp of thought. I don't want to interrupt you. Please.
All right. Well, I guess the final question then is, you're talking about the personalization of AI being a great benefit to society as a whole and to individuals. It seems to me that a good deal of the work of leadership is attempting to meet the needs of those who are led, right? A kind of personalization as is possible to the individual. So how do you think artificial intelligence will change what it means to be a leader and how leadership functions?
It's actually the second time you've asked me that question. I'm not sure whether I dodged it the first time or never got to it. That's really a great question. I don't think leadership changes in many respects. Leaders will still need to lead from a position of humility. Leaders will still need to be selfless. Leaders will still need to be guided by a study of the classics. And leaders will, I think, inherently have to spend the time to study the emerging technologies to ensure that as those technologies are applied in the battle space or on the battlefield, they are done in the optimal, in the maximal way that's possible to apply those technologies, but do it within the context of the rule of law. And I think that's really the challenge that we're going to have. It's going to change the way we educate our officers, I think. It's going to require us to think, I have a very dear friend by the name of Jim Mattis. When I was producing the infantry lieutenants that were going out to Jim Mattis's battalion to get ready to attack Saddam Hussein's forces in Desert Storm, he wrote me or called me one day from his vehicle in the desert and said, "We got a problem with your lieutenants." I thought, oh my God, what's this? And he said, "They can't think fast enough for the kind of war we're going to fight." In other words, you've been training them at a speed which doesn't permit them to understand what warfare will look like going 35 or 40 miles an hour over the desert, calling for supporting arms, calling in close air support, calling in naval gunfire at a speed which we've never had to deal with before. You've got to accelerate the capacity of the lieutenants to deal with this technology. That, I think, will be the challenge that ultimately our leaders in the 21st century are going to have, and that is to understand the technology and deal with that technology in a manner that gets the most out of it for our operational accomplishments. And I think that's going to change, in many respects, the way we educate our officers. I was very honored a couple of years ago to be the senior Marine on a Department of the Navy study on the education of our officers. Mike Mullen, Admiral Mullen was the Navy senior officer and I was the Marine. And the question that we tabled was not the unchallenged technological capabilities of the United States Naval Service. The question that we were challenged with, have we equipped intellectually our officers to understand what that technology is, what it can do, and how it's going to change, and how it changes in the context of the character of war, so that the nature of war can create the equilibrium that we need. This is a really wicked issue, because technology is moving so quickly that the capacity to evaluate its capabilities is a real challenge for the nature of war, which is the human dimension. And I think, at institutions like the Naval Academy and others, that's going to be the great challenge going forward. As technology changes, how do we equip our midshipmen, the young men and women who are going to lead our troops in close combat and lead our forces later as they become more senior to think about these technologies in ways that gets the most out of them.
Thank you, sir.
Yep, you're welcome.
We'll have an opportunity to warmly thank the General for his time, but perhaps we can take this opportunity to thank the interviewers for their very thoughtful and probing questions. Thank you very much. The General has very graciously agreed to take a handful of questions from the floor. There's a microphone here to my left, and I invite you to queue up